Okay, so I'll start the discussion. First of all, thank you, Professor Fressoz, for this super interesting talk, and also for sending the first chapters of the book, More and More and More, an all-consuming history of energy, to us. So me, Lucian, and Zulfiyya, we presented the discussion on...
Introduce yourself. Where you come
Okay. So my name is Arthur, and I'm from the Netherlands.
Zulfiyya from Azerbaijan.
And I'm Lucian from France and Britain.
So we based this presentation mostly on like talks that we could find online, and then also on the first few chapters that were sent to us to prepare this discussion. So the first part that we want to do is sort of like contextualize the professor more in the light of like the broader history of energy and the field of how people think about energy. And some of these names you've already seen coming by. And basically what we want to show here is that energy, of course, is a very interdisciplinary field. And therefore, there are a lot of different lenses or perspectives that different experts take on this issue. Only the point that we would want to make here is that all these authors, implicitly or explicitly, take this notion of the energy transition into their perspectives, whilst, as we've seen during the talk, it's not really like an energy transition. We're talking more about like an energy addition. Then a second part that we would like to use to include in our analysis is basically to talk about Jevons paradox, because we think that this is one of the underlying concepts that is one of the economic concepts that's really at the basis of this analysis. And as a short refresher, what happens with Jevons paradox is that the moment when we have efficiency increase, so we reduce the cost of energy from price A to price B, this does not lead to a reduction in the use of the energy, but we're going to use more of it, as we can see by the shift to B. And the reason for this is not only that it becomes cheaper, but that we find more and more different ways of using this energy as well. And the second interesting note is that the idea of Jevons paradox is old. It comes from the 19th century. However, it has been repopularized only in the 1980s and 1990s. And in the meantime, this was missing from the literature.
Yep. And I'm just going to quickly contextualize the method of Dr. Fressoz. And as is probably obvious, he used a consumption-based material flow accounting methodology to analyze the energy systems throughout history. And what this implies is looking at raw material consumption through raw material equivalents. So here, for example, I put an example of France in 2014, where you see the difference in imports and exports in terms of raw materials, so directly being imported or exported, but then in terms of their raw material equivalents, which is clearly much bigger. And what that means is the materials, energy and labor used upstream in the extraction, production, refining of these imported or exported goods and materials. And so what Dr. Fressoz does, as you've seen in the talk, is a geographically and materially aggregated perspective, whilst bringing, well, because this is a very macro national view, but what Dr. Fressoz brings is granularity at a industrial, supply chain and sectoral level.
Having seen the presentation, we have seen that the concept of transition without changing the behavior of economic relations were like put emphasis a lot of times, and we felt the need to discover degrowth and post-growth literature, and I would like to read some part of them. The literature that we discovered. First, Hornberg 2010, also criticizing the role of technology in this process, saying that technologies designed to solve one kind of problem will ironically tend to generate even more severe problems of another kind. And the second one, again Hornberg 1992, the neoclassical concept of growth was borrowed from a natural science founded on the mechanical worldview of Isaac Newton, to whom it would simply meant the process of aggregation, which we understand current understanding of growth. And there is a natural science where they took organic perception of growth, where it's by Schrödinger called appropriation of order, which is transformation of systems. And the author mentions in the end that economists seem to remain confined with the old mechanical version of growth. And finally, the book review, Why Malthus Was Wrong and Why Environmentalists Should Care. It's mentioned the quote, Malthus imagined a limited world in order to justify growth. He celebrates the abundant world that romantics contemplated. Having said that, I would like to deep dive into the graphs that were mentioned in Hornborg's 1992 article. Here we see the first graph where we see the loop, which is which can be to reproduce itself. So according to the author, as long as we have the energy shining on the earth, the sun shining on the earth, we can have a loop that is reproducing itself, and we have coexistence of human society with its environments, and it's mostly happening with agricultural societies. On the other hand, however, we have the second graph where we see industrial society, and here we see that the repurposing of energy use in the process, because energy is not used to coexist human society with ecology, but to sustain the industrial production using labor and technology. And the second the notion by Novi 2020, where I would say it's more a bit also theoretical notions and structuralists in a way. We see the trilemma by Dani Rodrik. Here we see that according to the author, we need to eliminate one of them in order to have both coexisting. And here we have hyperglobalization, nation state, and democracy. And for example, the author gave a lot of historical examples. For example, having hyperglobalization and nation state was in the time historically golden straitjacket time, where the gold standard was implemented, and there was not democracy, or it was absent or limited, but there was a strong emphasis on nation state and hyperglobalization. In Bretton Woods times, where there was a slacking back from globalization, but there was a rising democracy and still importance of nation state. And the imagination of the author, which is called global governance, which is the democracy and hyperglobalization of having one like a very integrated world where like there is no border or limited meaning of this. But in the end, author also 11 years after criticized that the hyperglobalization can also be limited, and the emphasis on social orders and should be can be emphasized more with its own within the democracy. And according to the Novi itself, who makes another graph showing other where we can pick one of them. It's called nationalistic capitalism, liberal globalism, and foundational economy. And nationalistic capitalism was the way of rising power which would resolve the current problems of liberal economies. Liberal globalism, it's what we hear most of the time, having market solutions. And foundational economy is the author's contribution, saying that we shouldn't focus on one specific policy or electing one specific person. For example, Trump elected and one policy would be implemented or stuff, but mostly long-term transformational change, which he would say foundational economy, which is based on planetary coexistence, and where we have socioeconomic democratization, selective economic deglobalization, and global governance. And finally, I would like to also, apart from theoretical notions, mention one empirical study by Daniel O'Neill and other authors mentioned there. So the purpose of this article was basically to see if humans by fulfilling their basic needs can exist within global boundaries. And in this graph, we see biophysical boundaries transgressed versus social thresholds achieved, and the ideal place in this graph would be top left corner, but however we see that it's not the case in real world, and so no country performs well on both via physical and social indicators, and the more social thresholds country achieves, the more biophysical borders transgresses. And which is also interesting, there are 34 countries that didn't pass even one social threshold and stayed in 0. And so there are two main outcomes of this empirical study. First is having self-sufficiency. So the authors claim that if we want to have have a proper transformation, we need to ensure that everyone has basic needs achieved. And the second one, we need to shift to green energies, however, not forgetting the Jevons paradox.
So now we're going to pass to critiques, although ironically mine isn't really a critique just yet, but it's just describing how I think Dr. Fressoz has deconstructed stages narratives of energy history in a sort of two-step schema, but you described it very well, so I will go relatively quickly. But the idea is that the stages accounts of history have got the timing and the causality wrong. Most of the time the transition, when it did happen in terms of technology, happened much later and it was incremental. And the causes of this transition were different to what these accounts claim. And then obviously he brings in the material footprint, or what I've coined material footprint analysis. And the main takeaway, however, is that there are technological substitutions, but no material substitution in its place. And so despite some of the rhetoric in the chapters, the argument is not actually falsifying creative destruction, it's just limiting it to the scope that it was originally made for, which was technology and not these grand narratives of epochal ruptures of material consumption.
So focusing a little bit more on this notion of Schumpeterian Darwinism that is critiqued in the first chapters of the book. One of the first critiques that we would like to make is that we are afraid that by critiquing Schumpeterian Darwinism, we throw out the baby with the bathwater. And what we mean by this is that actually this idea of symbiosis and coevolution can be traced back through the thought of evolutionary economists. We see this in the work by Nelson and Winter, but also by Giovanni Dossi when he talks about technological paradigms and technological trajectories. And in a more recent work by Brian Arthur, he explains it like this, that the whole collection of all technologies that have ever existed, past and present, originate from the use of natural phenomena and build organically upon each other. So, how does Brian Arthur develop this idea? Basically, what he says is when we look at technology in the grand scheme of things, we should see it as a network that wherein the nodes are the different technologies, and then the links that you see between the nodes are these interdependencies or symbiosis in this framework. And what you can see, this is not a random network. There are these groups of technological paradigms that are interdependent on each other and therefore built upon each other in his framework. And the second notion that is important is that there's this hierarchical structure between technological paradigms. And what we could say maybe to come up with a potential answer for why this symbiosis is so important is that this hierarchical structure explains a little bit why we're using more wood, coal, steel, oil and gas. Is basically that these technologies are at the origin of our technological tree. And the longer we keep on developing and making this technological tree more complex, we keep relying more and more on these core technologies that are at the basis of everything. Then a part of this critique, though, also wants to focus on how solar PV might be different. So where there's this symbiosis relationship between wood and coal and oil that we've seen during the presentation, I would argue that solar technology is part of a new technological paradigm that is more symbiotic with things like computer chips and polysilicon. And even though this, of course, still has a material base, it might be way smaller than the material base of the oil and gas. So summarizing, I would say that we have to watch out with putting this as a polarized framing, that we shouldn't see it as a false dichotomy where we say on the one hand we could go for Schumpeterian Darwinism, and on the other hand we can think only about reducing material consumption. We should think of an of-the-above approach where we integrate first the reduction of material resources, but then also see how we can do more with less through innovation and talk about redistribution.
And now for the actual critique from me. So I'm going to focus on the politics, the role of politics and capitalism in the history of energy, and particularly in Dr. Fressoz's work. One striking quote that we came across was the one in the first few pages: "Getting out of carbon will be far more difficult than getting out of capitalism," which made us think a lot. But I, personally at least, was slightly dissatisfied with I thought there was a bit of a lack of an answer to that question of why is that the case, at least in the first few chapters that we read. But you do give us a few tips on how to answer that question. So on one hand, he tells us that global warming is a tragedy of abundance rather than scarcity, so abundance is highlighted there. And you show us repeatedly how the substitution processes, technological ones, have always been trumped by the expansion of markets, rebound effects, and the reorientation of raw materials to other uses. So to me, intuitively, this abundance is very closely intertwined with the fact that capital always finds a new use for abundant resources, which often, through material symbiosis, leads to increased material consumption. However, to me, this pattern and this link or the mechanisms behind it remain under-theorized, and the rest of this critique is going to be to try and develop that. So one clue to potentially expand on this theorization is David Harvey's spatial temporal fix. So he is also interested in abundance, more through the frame of capital accumulation, and his theory is that capital generates surpluses and needs to find ways to absorb them through further geographical expansion. And so to expand geographically, in an oxymoronic way, they have to fix themselves through capital and often infrastructure. And so it talks about a lock-in effects, which is Bonneuil and Fressoz in The Shock of the Anthropocene also acknowledge. And then there's an interesting also development of this notion of spatio-temporal fix, where he explores the ambiguous relationship between the state and capital within these global political hegemonic projects and dynamics. But to me, I thought it quite striking that this theory didn't come across or appear anywhere in the book, nor was there a particular interest, or it seemed interest or sign of a further systematization and theorization of the processes described in More and More and More. And again, two potential tips on why that is. One is a quote from your talk in 2022 at l'École des Ponts. The political world does not really have control or say in the mode of production. So potentially, does that represent a sort of apolitical vision of the history of energy? Not apolitical in the sense of there are no power relations, but apolitical in the sense of there is no political project behind it that can really shape it. And then the second one, the history of energy is not written in advance and it has no internal logic. That's a quote from The Shock of the Anthropocene in 2017. And does that imply that there is an impossibility of actually creating a systemic theoretical framing for these processes? I want to just elucidate the points I'm making here through a critique of Timothy Mitchell and Andreas Malm. Unfortunately, you didn't expand on those slides, but I mean, I'm not going to go in the nitty-gritty detail, but in 2017, there seems to be a consensual reading of Mitchell, where you seem to largely agree with him, whereas from 2020 onwards, there's a clear disagreement in the causal chain that Timothy Mitchell traces, which is, from what we've talked about, it makes sense, right? Because it's a stagist narrative, etc., etc. However, what we miss in your account of Timothy Mitchell, I think, is the broader political and hegemonic project that he describes, in particular through his description of the Marshall Plan and its implementation in Europe through the prism of oil and especially the petrodollar. So one of the quotes here is that the whole purpose of the Marshall Plan was to secure the role of the dollar as the basis of the global financial system built on the petrodollar and the influence and control that the US had in the Middle East. And so like with Harvey, Mitchell draws out tensions between state intentions and corporate interests with regards to oil and the Marshall Plan. I'm not going to go into the detail, but he basically brings some nuance to this homogenous political project, a bit like Harvey did. And what seemed bizarre to me is that in the 2 chapters of More and More and More, there was no reference to a global hegemonic project and those relations to energy systems. But there was a clear recognition of that in 2017. And similarly for Malm, there's a consensual reading of Malm in 2017, whereas disagreement in More and More and More. You've described the disagreement there, but so be it. And but I think the great contribution from Malm's book is the theoretical development through a Marxian history of energy that he does. So he's very interested in the role of energy as a pseudo-commodity and its role and place in the circulation of capital. So although the use of fossil fuels is not value creating in itself, it is necessary to constantly increase. Okay. Just to say that he shows how energy, well, through capital circulation, capitalists are very interested in expanding the role of energy in the circulation of capital, and that leads to stratifications of value chains and different energy systems that lead to the production of different levels of value added. Yep, and I think we can skip that.
Yeah, and just to conclude with several seconds, so we discussed material consumption and Jovan's paradox, transition concept and criticism in capitalism, and if it's possible to have a good life within planetary boundaries, and our 2 main critiques, and this is our questions to discuss. Thank you.
You are lucky because this time there are only 3 questions. Okay.
Thank you.
Some of them ask 10 or 20.
Yeah, so I will mainly talk about the way the historiography on energy has taken up the issue of climate change in the most stupid way, which is indeed this conspiracy theory. You know, climate change is a kind of conspiracy, the result of a conspiracy of capitalism. This is what you've got from the reading of Malm and Mitchell, you know. The steam engine is a kind of plot from the capitalists to go where the workers are in the cities. Yeah, this is so false, so idiotic. The capitalists hate the cities. If they can stay in the countryside, they prefer. People are less, you know, they are less socialist. It's much calmer in the countryside. You can read any discourse from a capitalist in the 19th and even the 20th century. They say that, right? Ford is saying that, for instance. Châtal in France is saying that in the 19th century. So, I mean. And then, you know, why people started to use steam engine, which is not an important issue. We don't care about steam engine in the 1830s. It's such a cliche, old-fashioned way of seeing the history of energy. I'm really appalled by that, actually. I mean, you know, looking at steam engine in 1830. So what's happened in Manchester? It's around Manchester. It is true that, and there has been papers on that, that there was a bottleneck. There was not so much hydraulic power around Manchester where the good artisans were, basically. So you had to put steam engines there. It doesn't mean that, of course, there was a lot of water power left elsewhere, and they will be developed later, right? So, I mean, it's not that I disagree, it's just that this is false, you know? It's just simply false. Historically, it is false. There is no need of entering on all this complex debate about capitalism. It is just the fact doesn't work out like that. And then if you take Tim Mitchell's, the idea that coal, is very labor-intensive, difficult to extract because it is a solid, whereas oil is fluid. The fluidity of oil is a nightmare in the early 20th century. You need tens of thousands of barrel manufacturer artisans to contain the fluidity of oil. This is a problem, not an advantage, right? And then coal is actually, the problem with Tim Mitchell's book is that he compares coal like as if it was congealed in the early 20th century with oil, modern oil of the 1960s. But oil actually employs a tremendous amount of labor. When oil starts to really enter into competition with coal, it's only in the second part of the 1950s where oil starts to conquer the market of electricity, for instance, which was not the case before. At that point, coal mines would employ far less employees than oil fields in the US, right? So it's a way to circumvent the workers. This is rubbish. Completely rubbish. And then, the fact that you cannot organize a serious trade unions around oil, come on. Like the Teamster Union in the US, it's one of the most powerful union ever. There are more than 5 million people inscribed in this Teamster Union. It's a continental union with Canada and the US together. And then the fact that there would be less social movement around oil fields. What? In Mexico, in Iran. There are a lot of revolutions coming out of oil fields. It's really a very serious issue. And lastly, coal can be fluid. It's not a problem. Actually, from the 1920s onward, like in electric power plants, for cement manufacture, coal would be grinded in a very fine powder that would be transported through tubes, just like oil. And in electric power plant, they can burn oil or it's called pulverized coal, the same machines, doesn't matter. And they buy both, actually, given the price of the... the problem is that it doesn't look at the history of production. How you extract coal in the 20th century after 1950, it's with machines, So, it's a really serious issue because there is a fascination with materialist explanation of the politics, but without any serious inquiry into the production, right? So, I think for the left, it's very important not to have this very, very crude stages narrative, where, most of the development on capitalism and so on, you can say exactly the same thing with the word development. And then all the political charge vanished. So, no, I think it's a serious intellectual issue here. So the questions. Why is getting out of carbon more difficult than getting out of capitalism? Well, because several countries were not capitalist, they were very carbon intensive. To produce food without carbon, good luck. Without methane, without fertilizer, frankly, no, it's not possible. You cannot have planes, you cannot have roads, it's difficult without cement, and cement without carbon is very difficult. You cannot have modern buildings, you don't have steel. Yeah. Getting rid of carbon is far, far more difficult than getting rid of capitalism. Then, what role political projects are in shaping America? Okay, I think basically the way you produce things, government have very little to say about that, and they cannot change that. There is not 100 ways of doing cement. There are 3 ways of doing steel. Right? Not anymore, not more, right? So, you should not overestimate the power of any government, even the most powerful ones, in the way they can shift the way you do things, And this illusion is extremely dangerous because it's a technophilic illusion. There will be through innovation, we're going to change the way we do everything. No, what we have to discuss is not how you're going to decarbonize everything. It's to realize that part of it can be decarbonized. Electricity is probably the best example. But electricity is just 40% of emissions. Then there are all the rest. And you mentioned the kind of photovoltaics, which is interesting because indeed I think it's a very important technology. But the issue of symbiosis here is not so much about the photovoltaic panels itself. It's about what you're going to do with all this clean electricity. If it is to power 2 tons automobiles, which are going to be using roads made of cement, of concrete, of bitumen and other things, and then which promote the urban expansions, bigger houses with more stuff inside, then you don't solve anything. So, of course, the symbiosis is not, I mean, there is a symbiosis between windmills, solar panels, and carbon. Of course there is. I mean, they are not, you don't have a solar panel on trees, you can't grow solar panels. But it's not the issue. The issue is what you're going to do with all this electricity. In what ways can we persuasion between innovation and well, basically, I mean, of course, my book is based on this Jevon paradox, but Jevon, I mean, if you read Jevon's book, he's completely mono-energetic. He's obsessed with coal. And he says, I mean, basically Britain started to use coal because there was not much forest left. This is so wrong, you know. I mean, it's not like that, the story. And there are plenty of rebound effects, but I mean, not on the same material, but on all the other materials. Because the rising consumption of coal, Britain used much more wood. I mean, it's what I explained during my talk, right? So yes, it is closely connected to the Jevon paradox, but it's a kind of expanded version where everything grows together. Not just the technologies which become more efficient. Well, I don't know if it answers to all your question. But I think the most important thing is basically the discussion should not remain so abstract. We have to, I mean, normally we have to get to carbon neutrality in 30 years. It's tomorrow, really. I mean, and so you have to really think in terms of quantitative terms. I mean, I think it's really important to put figures and to talk about specific technologies. I mean, like it's not like the technology. I mean, electricity, for instance, can be decarbonized. Probably many other things not. You see, I mean, you have to be more specific.
Now it's time to open the floor. And yeah, great. Because students don't like when I say that, but girls are very welcome to raise questions. Don't be shy. So I propose that we have possibly 2 waves. We have 20 minutes. We have possibly 2 waves of 3 questions. But okay, you have a question. You have a question. Wow, incredible. I'm so happy. So you will be the first one for the second wave. You have a question, you. And please introduce yourself, especially in terms of country. Okay?
Hello, my name is Matilda. I'm from Germany. Thank you for the presentation and for the critiques. I wanted to ask if you've also started to look into carbon capture and storage and how the synergies that you were referring to apply to this as well. I'm thinking in terms of like pipelines that are being used for CO2 or biomass that's being used for BECCS, which is the most used one in the scenarios in the IPCC.
Thanks also from my side. Sarah from Germany as well. I find your argument about abandoning this idea of energy transition very convincing from an analytical perspective. I'm asking myself, speaking more from a political perspective and from, I don't know, narrative path dependencies, whether you would say it is sensible to abandon that altogether, or, and if so, if you have any alternative ideas how one could speak about this transition that maybe isn't a transition, or whether you think maybe there's some merit to that narrative, maybe it could be used in a progressive and useful way.
Can I answer any 2 questions? Or no?
Let's take 3 if you don't mind. 3 by 3. Okay.
My question is really just I'm sorry. I'm Isabella from Brazil. And it's just that the part that you spoke about how it expanded on the Jevon's paradox, it was a bit fast. So can you explain why it expands again? Thank you.
Okay, now you can.
Okay. So the first one, basically, you have to go back to the coal question book. Is really, I mean, everything revolves around coal, and it doesn't talk at all or very little about the other materials. And he has this, I mean, I think he introduced this stagist idea that, you know, we run out of wood and so we had to go to coal, which I don't think is so good. And then it's really how steam engine being more efficient, you use more coal, but actually because of steam engine being more efficient, you are using more of everything, right? Okay, so then there is the issue of the word transition. I think there is a very simple answer. Basically, we have to have, I mean, what we are doing when we install solar panels, windmills, and less so with electric car, we reduce the carbon intensity of the economy. We don't do an energy transition, which is really not a rigorous word. So I think it's important to put it like this, because if you say we reduce the carbon intensity of the economy, it leaves on the table the size of the economy. And so I think, I mean, what I would recommend to economists would be not to dream about a decarbonized world by 2050. This is rubbish. There will be plenty of carbon in the economy by 2050, but where is it? Where it should be? If you want to be normative, where should we invest the carbon that, you know, will be there? There is useful CO2, less useful CO2, and economics should be able to guide us in trying to differentiate between the two. But of course, because of, and here I accept the word capitalism, because of capitalism, it is value that matters in the economic calculus. So like cement, for instance. Cement is very carbon intensive, difficult to decarbonize. You can use it to make very useful things, like a water network in the poor world, or you can use it to make a skyscraper in Manhattan. In terms of value, the skyscraper in Manhattan is probably will be worth much more because, of course, the price of the square meter, right? But in terms of social value, not so obvious. So I think economics should be studying that and not making all these net zero scenarios, because, and that leads me to your question about BECCS. Indeed, it's amazing that, I mean, integrated assessment models have naturalized this idea of BECCS, bioenergy carbon capture and storage, which is the way to do negative emissions now. So we are talking about BECCS, blah, 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 but I mean, how much BECCS do we do right now, right? And in the net zero scenarios, you got such an amount of BECCS. It is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, in the last IPCC report, the 2022, they have decreased because in the 2014 it was just absurd. And everybody acknowledged it was absurd. In some scenarios, you would need 3 times the size of India with forest plantation of eucalyptus growing very fast that would be burnt in power plant where CO2 will be captured and put in the ground. Come on, okay. So in the last report, it's among the range of scenarios, you need between 170 gigatons to 900 gigatons of BECCS. So it's like, let's say, before 2000. So like it could be up to 14 gigatons per year of CO2, which would be captured from trees. Okay, you know what is the world production of forest right now? It's 4 gigatons. Okay, so we're going to multiply by 3 the amount of food that we harvest. What does it mean? I mean, to do that, we would need to be invested on this for centuries or decades and reduce the size of agriculture. I mean, this is incredibly stupid, this discussion around BECCS, right? Really. So, I mean, what bothers me is, you know, because of this net zero, there's also public money going into that. Like the Drax power plants I mentioned, it is heavily subsidized. They receive billions of pounds each year in public subsidies to produce neutral electricity. This is rubbish. This is not carbon neutral electricity. I mean, they are cutting down trees in America with oil engines, I mean, chainsaw and so on. I mean, this is really wrong, really. So, I mean, what is extremely worrying is that, in fact, the fossil fuel industry has infiltrated the Group 3. It is really what has happened. Because all this CCS were thought as utter rubbish in the 1980s. Because it's not at scale for large power plants. It's polluting actually to capture CO2, right? You need ammoniac, basically something derived from ammoniac, which is polluting. And then it's very energy intensive. So you reduce the efficiency of the power plant. For every 3 power plants, you need a 4th power plant to power the BECCS system, the CCS system, right? So all the experts were saying that, come on, this is rubbish. That makes coal more expensive than atom than nuclear electricity. So we'll never do that. And then in 1991, the fossil fuel industry started to say, we're going to push CCS. The US government pushed CCS, Canada pushed CCS, and Norway pushed CCS. There were like conferences on CCS, journals talking about CCS. And then there is a 2005 report of the IPCC Group 3, which has completely naturalized CCS. And after this report, there is a scientific explosion on CCS, right? And it is before the Paris conference in 2015, and it is BECS that made the Paris Accord possible, the Paris Agreement. It is BECS which makes the carbon neutrality reachable, which makes 2 degrees possible, right? And because, of course, and it's even better than that, you put net value actualization. So all the future investment in all these technologies after 2050, they don't cost a lot because you put, how do you say actualization in English? Time preference, basically you got time preference, so yeah. And then you put also learning curves. Every technology will be cheaper in the future because there is technological progress, which is a strong hypothesis actually. And that makes the 2 degrees Celsius target, economically achievable. So yes, I think BECS is really an interesting issue, and it shows many, many problems in the climate expertise, around the climate expertise.
Okay. Second and very last wave, we have 10 minutes only, but no, thank you. Very clear, very efficient. So you raise your hand. Okay, who else? Who else? It's like in a marriage, it's now or never. Okay, you, last one? No? Okay.
What would be your, Sylvain, France, what would be your, have you got any ideas of how we can solve this problem? You said that degrowth is not mentioned or very, not much mentioned. So, do you think there is a possibility for this issue to, for this word to grow in the debate, so that we will put first this this idea of changing society toward a less material dependence? That's my question.
Hey, I'm Juan Castillo from Mexico. Thank you very much. I was thinking of this logic that we buy in transition theory, that climate change calls for a change of technology, not a change of civilization. Can we then think of having a change in civilization without having a change in technology necessarily? I was thinking in the case of Mexico and oil expropriation of 1938, that was really done in a really anti-colonialist discourse. But years after, the evaluation of it was like the reproduction of same consumption patterns of more and more. So yeah.
Okay. Thanks. So now, yeah, no, but you have 9 minutes.
Okay. No, I mean, on these 2 questions, I don't have much to say because they are like impossible questions to answer. I mean, honestly, I think intellectually, yeah, I think degrowth will probably emerge as an important topic in economics and beyond. I mean, you can notice that actually already. There are many books, but now there are more. For instance, in 24, there was a model of integrated assessment models, a team at IHESS who made a degrowth, who modelized degrowth for Australia. They use their model that normally put like 2 or 3% growth per year. There they capped the GDP, or they even decreased it. And it's not very surprising, but it makes things easier. It doesn't mean that you don't have to develop solar panels. Of course, you need renewables. That's not the issue, but it makes things easier. I mean, the deployment is slower, and you need less negative emissions that we are mentioning in my previous answer. So yes, I think that scientifically it will be a growing issue in the next years. But then I'm not sure it will have so much influence on decisions, on the functioning of the economy. I mean, we can be dubious about that. Yes, I agree. And the other question, I'm not sure I perfectly understood your point, but of course the nationalization of oil in Mexico is a good example of, like a social movement that had a tremendous importance for the history of the country. When I said a change of civilization, I just wanted to point out the fact that we're not talking about just changing the production of electricity. And the problem is most of the issue has been framed as a question of electricity production. But once again, electricity production is just 40% of the emission. Then there is all the rest, where I think it's about, kind of civilizational choices, about the place of the automobile, the way we imagine what is a good economy. I mean, yes, we're talking about really deep entrenched things, yes, which I doubt we'll be able to change in 30 years. That's why my publisher said, okay, I had this title, Sans transition, une nouvelle histoire de l'énergie, but the French publisher wanted something more punchy, and he wanted the transition will not happen, and many people were shocked by this sentence. So I was criticized just for this, how you say, banner, the red banner on the book. But in fact, if you look at the forecasters, the International Energy Agency, but they don't see any transition coming. I mean, the coal remains quite high, even if it could decrease by 2050 a little bit, but oil and gas are just going to plateau, basically. So, I mean, it's just, this banner was just, reassessing what the experts are saying, and it seems shocking, but in fact it is completely normal and standard.
Thanks for your time. Very